I spent this morning polishing this talk and trying to figure out how to make research sexy, so I kind of hope I get there. It's one of those topics that I'm hardened by how many people are in the room because I wouldn't show up for this talk. So, in any case, we have a Liberal government in place, and one of the first things, if any of you were paying attention to research that the Liberal government did, was reinstate the long-form census and really try and reinvigorate Statistics Canada. We've had a long history as a nation of having a really robust research infrastructure, a really robust intellectual landscape, and data collection that is the envy of many other developed nations. So Minister Kirsty Duncan, who is the Minister of Science, convened this panel and had us investigate what we call fundamental research. And I just want to make clear that this is research that we call fundamental, basic, or unfettered. It means not what an industry partner asks us to research, but what researchers in the discipline and maybe the community have in mind for researchers to engage with. There was a simultaneous review happening at the same time under Minister Navdeep Bains, who is the Minister of Innovation, and they were looking at more commercializable stuff. It was a pretty august group. 7 Orders of Canada, 1 Nobel Peace Prize, and me. So I kind of felt a little bit intimidated, but it was a really important inclusion for me to be there, I feel, not because of me personally, but as a woman researcher, as a social scientist / humanist. I'm a historian and sociologist, and as somebody who is not from Toronto, Vancouver, or Montreal. I think it was really important that those kinds of issues got brought to the table, and I will say that they were. So we were given 2 main research questions. First of all, is there any gaps in the program, and what needs to be addressed? So we started pretty neutrally, like not assuming that there were gaps, and then asking how it was that we were doing in comparison with Canada's previous performance, how we compared with other comparable countries, and whether or not there were models that we could emulate. And I'm not going to cover all of this because, in fact, the report ended up being 280 pages long, and I don't think we've got time or interest to go there with it. We did an online portal, and we had over 1,300 submissions, many of them from organizations such as universities, but also faculty associations, student associations, things like research organizations that work outside of university structures. We held face-to-face meetings with over 230 researchers across the country. These researchers included everything from graduate students through to Nobel laureates. So we really tried to cover the waterfront that way. We also did a ton of research and had a secretariat that was dedicated to the job, and we interviewed over 200 bureaucrats, politicians, and statisticians on the State of the Union. As I say, we met and produced this 280-page report, and last March was the initial launch. It was launched after the budget was announced, and that was strategic because they wanted to give it a year to sort of ramp it up so that all of these lobby groups could actually engage with pressing with members of parliament, ministers, all that stuff. And that's really why I want to talk to you guys today, because we have, as a university, officially sent letters in. A faculty association has sent letters in. I gave a talk on campus in which we collected a petition, and I think it's important that community members also have their voice added to this chorus. So when it's done, I'll send Knut a letter and as a template, and where you can send it to, and if you feel so moved, please write to the minister and to the Minister of Finance, who is the one that I understand now really matters, and ask him and her to support research in Canada. One other group that has been active in this is Universities Canada, which is a sort of a nonprofit organization that represents university interests across the country. And they, on the heels of our report, did a survey of Canadian citizens like yourselves and asked them what they thought about universities today in Canada. And these are some of the results that they came up with. And I just want to say it's kind of, you can see in the descending order of color, a kind of a sad tale. We're friendly, we do valuable research at 77%, but down at the bottom, we start to see ourselves sliding back when it comes to being world class. This is perception, of course, dynamic and adequately funded. So if I could have written this list and done it this way, that would have been, the way I would have loved to have seen it play out. And Canadians feel this way and understand the system to be looking this way. This was a survey of 2,500 people across the country. When asked the question that I care most about as a research leader, the question is, how important is research in Canada? They feel that research work in Canada is vitally important to 84% of the respondents. This is actually a really significant kind of a finding. And the other 16 said it's nice, but really it doesn't matter. I think the more you know about universities, the more you understand that university teaching and university research are connected intimately with one another. We bring our research to the classroom, we bring our students into our research arenas, whether it's a lab or an interview setting. And so they're not really separate in any way, although I think some people, and I see it with my really junior students, they're surprised to know that we even do research. They think it's just a bigger school. But research is a big part of what universities do. So why would we care about research if you weren't a researcher and didn't have your own personal passion? So at the macro level, and these are findings that the panel came up with, we know that there's lots and lots of societal benefits to the kind of research that we see our colleagues at the universities doing. It produces longer and healthier lives. Canada enjoys one of the longest lifespans in the world compared to similarly developed countries. It develops technology, but it also helps to produce good policy that will improve our quality of life, that will help us to improve our citizenship. It sustains our standard of living. The list is on and on and on. So at the macro level, research is very, very helpful. At the sort of local level, which is what I tried to push for a little bit in my work at the table as part of the panel, we can see other kinds of outcomes. We have 600 graduate students per year who float through the hallways of the University of Lethbridge. All of them are engaged with research. They're engaged with learning how to think critically, how to develop a problem, a statement of a problem, imagine a solution to it, and investigate the efficacy of that solution. This is good citizenship, and this is the kind of leadership that research trains our young people to do. This is an elevated kind of a list, but in the next slide, I want to show you just what that can actually mean in terms of hard dollars and cents. In the meanwhile, before I go forward, I just want to say that fundamental research, this notion of research that is driven by knowledge that is produced within a discipline or that is produced by a researcher who has spent decades developing a deep and intimate knowledge of a particular social problem, is very often research that doesn't get funded because it isn't sexy or interesting to industry. But the reality is that very often the kinds of things that researchers will develop will 10, 15, 20 years later find themselves and their way into an application. I don't know if people know who Hedy Lamarr is here, but Hedy, she's been again recently in the news because she developed the technology in the 50s that is the basis of Wi-Fi. And it has been made commercializable in an applicable kind of a way 50 to 60 years later. We never know, right, what technology can do or where it's going to be developed. So, what does it mean to Lethbridge, and Lethbridge particularly? Just taking hard dollars, never mind those higher order kinds of, we produce good citizens, or we investigate with passion, or we love our work, or we improve the quality of life. None of that. Let's just take dollars, and let's only take federal government dollars. Federal government research funding directly supports over 200 undergraduate students every summer. We have those students working on our research projects funded through federal student awards. These are our best and our brightest. That adds up to $0.4 million every summer. Research funding directly supports about 150 graduate and master's students, and that money is based on their excellence. They're not all of our graduate students get funded in this way, but this is, again, the brightest and the best of our graduate students. That totals, again, another $0.4 million. Research funding, and this is where the big one comes in. This is where folks like me make a grant application to the federal government and bring in a grant, and we hire students. And this happens in between 60 and 70% of federal research dollars that go to research projects actually go to student support. I've had pretty close to $1 million over the last 15 years in research funding, which is it's nothing compared to what many researchers have, but as a historical sociologist, it's kind of stunning. And I've been able to put through 12 master's students, a graduate student, and a postdoctoral fellow, and I've provided them life support to a total of 25 years worth of living money and income out of the money that I've received from the federal government. So 60 to 70% of that money comes in, and it goes right to students, and we generate every year on average about $9 million worth of funding. So that comes to $5.56 million that goes to students. They live here, they buy their groceries, they get their gas, they do all of these things. So the direct injection, if you want to say, of capital based on the research funding that is generated by researchers at the University of Lethbridge is close to $7 million a year. It's not bubkas, right? It's something that really actually affects not just the quality of life of students, but the local economy, local businesses, all of those things. So who actually pays for research, and how does research actually get funded? We earn about $9 million worth of federal funding at the University of Lethbridge, but that is not the entirety of the costs of doing research. So the federal panel actually looked at the cost of doing research, turning on lights, running payroll, having offices and space available, having faculty members, because in a sense, if I write a grant proposal and I do my research, it's like the big piece of that cost that isn't going to students is my salary. So 40% or 50% of my salary, which goes to research time, is being paid by universities, right? So it's like, how do we add all of that up and parse it out? I am not a statistician, and I don't know my way around it, but I will try and help us walk through this a little bit. There's really three kind of key components. I just want to point this one out. This one here at the bottom, she said with no mic. The one at the bottom is foreign investment is the lowest, and then we see business investment in research, and you can see that it's not really impressive. It has stayed flat. It has stayed low as a proportion of the overall cost, and these are non-inflation adjusted dollars, right? So the ones that we really see mattering most, and the ones that I want to discuss most about where the lion's share of the money come, are these top two lines, the blue solid one and the gray dotted one. The blue solid line reflects what we call GERD, which is basically, it's an acronym that means gross domestic expenditures on research. It basically means the number of federal government dollars that go directly to research costs in the country. And the other one is HERD, higher education expenditures on research, and this is the money that universities are paying to support the research enterprise through partial salaries of faculty, through providing buildings in which this can occur, through having payroll, all of those kinds of infrastructure costs. You can see that it's, surprisingly enough, we've seen an increase proportionally of the amount of money that's coming out of higher education itself to pay for the research enterprise. And while that may not seem like it's a problem, what it has really meant is that this happens to the detriment of other aspects of what universities do. This is the thing that, on paper, it's just a graph, but what it means in real life is we don't hire new faculty because we don't have money to replace positions. We increase course and class sizes because we have to tighten up on faculty levels. We ask faculty to sit more and more on service committees and things like this because there's fewer and fewer and fewer of them. So this creates a really tense post-secondary environment, and it creates a lot of pressure on faculty. And I think it's fair to say that the fact that the money has not increased in business, and the money that has not increased in government for over this 15 years to any appreciable amount has produced a pretty unhappy university climate. Sad news, eh? I should just give you an example of beside the faculty thing, of just what it might mean not to have an increase in funding over a 15-year period. So we have this thing in Canada called the Canada Research Chair Program, and it really is, you are brilliant and we want to bring you here, or you are brilliant and we're afraid someone's going to steal you, so we want to keep you here kind of money. And for a junior person, the transfer amount on that is $100,000, and it has been $100,000 since 2001. The issue there is in 2001, and I'll just full disclose here, I started at the University of Lethbridge in 2002, having had 2 postdocs and a PhD a couple of years before, for $55,000 a year. Wow. It was worth those 20 years of post-secondary education, I'm here to say. So $55,000, let's say, 2001. You have some money out of that $100K. You can set up a lab, you can give them some money to hire a couple of graduate students or a postdoctoral fellow, you can give them some money to organize a conference, all of that stuff. The average starting salary, never mind for somebody who is identified as excellent at the university these days, ranges between $80,000 and $90,000. So there's a gap there. There's a gap of $30,000 that isn't available to do all of those other things. So that's what I say when I say universities are picking up that gap tab, right? Okay, the current state of affairs. We decided, as I said earlier, that we would look at how Canada's doing in comparison with other countries and in comparison with what it is that we have done previously. We have always had a strong reputation as an intellectual leader internationally. We've had a strong performance in a number of fields. Space exploration, neuroscience are really 2 key examples. But we have found that our rankings have been slipping in terms of the number of publications that people have been pushing out, the number of dollars that people have been able to earn for research projects, and the number of citations. So even the quality of the work is starting to suffer. Canada also lags behind in things like Nobel nominations, nominations from learned societies or scientific groups internationally, and we have fallen behind other countries that compare with us. When we compared the way that money comes to these countries, we found that the government funding and higher education funding ratio that we see in Canada sitting, if you remember that last graph, with the universities supporting and the government, coming in a very, very deep second, we are exceptional in comparison to all G7 countries, and we are exceptional in comparison with 20 other nations that Israel, Australia, New Zealand, countries that we thought would, Greece, that would be comparable in size and scale. And a number of dollars that researchers per capita get in Canada has been in steady decline. So this is our report card. These are the countries that are these sort of small comparators, not G7. And you can see that Canada, the little red one, the little red engine that could, is actually not doing all that well. And countries like Singapore and Taiwan and Switzerland and Israel that really do, and there is when you see the data unpacked, which I'm not going to do for time purposes today, but when you see the data, there is a direct relationship between feeding the beast, paying for it, and getting good product out of it. It's just pretty simple. So what did the panel decide that it needed to do? Well, the first thing we asked for didn't cost any money, so that was easy and it's already in place. So we asked that there be some oversight panels put in place. There used to be such bodies under the previous government, and there has been a sort of dismantling of some of those structures as well. So some of this is like bring in the old measures that helped, and so there is now a scientific national panel that has oversight for funding, that has decision-making capacity, and that feeds directly not only to the minister, but provides input directly to the Prime Minister, which is a kind of an interesting thing, because what ends up happening politically is the science minister, as sexy as that sounds, isn't very sexy in the federal landscape. And so she, when it comes to a conversation of who's going to get the ear of the Prime Minister, will it be the Minister of Finance or will it be the Minister of Science? Well, you know where that's going to go. It's going to be the Finance Minister. So choosing to put this scientific panel in direct connection with the Prime Minister was a strategic decision that I hope will be really helpful. We've also established a chief scientific officer. This is like even Quebec has its own chief scientific officer and has had forever. And Quebec is actually, their performance elevates the rest of the country quite significantly. They have a very strong funding provincial program that supplements this lack of federal oversight. They have a very strong group that takes care of gaps between funding bodies and all of those kinds of things. And most other countries do have a chief scientific officer. So having one of these is something that is really important to sort of set the strategic direction. Another thing that the panel asked for is there's been a long-standing, I would say over the last 10 years for sure, a long-standing impetus with federal funding and with provincial funding as well to sort of insist that research be innovative. And by innovative, what this usually means is that it be commercializable, right? What you find out, can you actually make some money on it? And as I've said earlier, much research takes a long time to be commercializable, and so this becomes quite challenging. We're right now at 70% of the research money that we see in the overall research landscape being innovation focused, and 30% of it being unfettered research where somebody who has worked, Brian Kolb, who has worked in the field of neuroscience for 40 years and has this deep and rich program, can make decisions about where he thinks the next big wave is coming or where he thinks the next big important question is arising. In the current landscape, he's got a 30% window of obtaining money for that, unless he just happily coincides with a government initiative, and most of it is government driven. So the panel asked to reverse that, to make it 70% unfettered and 30% innovation, and see what science can do for itself. The third one is to, fund research adequately so universities aren't robbing the classroom in order to pay the researcher. And that's, I think, really important. Students are really on board with this. They fully understand that their quality of education is suffering, and it's in these kind of indirect ways. The fourth thing that they asked for is put some stable money into crumbling infrastructure. We heard stories from people across the country who, like we had researchers crying, and that's not a pretty sight. Talking about labs that they can't keep operating, talking about equipment, having to send their data somewhere else and have it come back, things getting lost. Other things like not having lights on funding where they've got this fabulous piece of equipment in a loading dock on a pallet, but they can't actually turn it on because they don't have operation and maintenance funding. This is not smart management. This is just not smart. So putting stable money into that and fund research in general, so the success rates are high, like I talked about, 8% for health research and in the low 20s for social science and humanities research. It's not tenable. It leaves too many people out. Okay, I'm going to zip through these ones. I'm not even going to zip through these ones because I've gotten a look. But I just want to talk about this. Right now, the way that infrastructure gets funded, research infrastructure gets funded, it kind of happens on an ad hoc basis. I work in the Office of Research Services, and we'll get a call, and it's like from the federal government, the CFI, Canadian Foundation for Infrastructure, and it's like, you have an allocation. Nobody knows how this allocation happens. I think it's just like somebody finds something under a placemat somewhere, or, who knows? It's, when you take your suit to the cleaners and it's like, oh, we better get rid of this. And so we see these really uneven kinds of records of how infrastructure gets funded. So one of the things that we really did ask for was to stabilize CFI funding so that researchers and universities can have a sense of what money is coming to them and make plans. I mean, we have this gorgeous big building over there, and we have to be making some plans about how to fill it. And under this kind of a jagged line, that gets real challenging. So we asked for a lot of money. It seems like a lot of money. So this is all the list of things, fund research chairs better, fund students better, stabilize the money for infrastructure, increase the success rates for researchers, forget about innovation and start letting researchers drive the machine. Maybe you could bump up our lab budgets a little bit. And it comes to, for the first year, and because we were terrified, to ask for too much. It comes to the first year to $386 million. And by year 4, we're actually asking for $1.3 billion. That sounds like so much money, doesn't it? But $1.3 billion is 0.4% of our federal budget. It is not a big portion of the federal budget. And the increase that we're asking for is 0.1.7. It's less than 0.2. And so we're not asking proportionately for a big increase, but we believe, and we believe strongly, that the impact of doing that for Canada reputationally, lifestyle-wise, quality of life-wise, training a next generation of new researchers, elevating our climate and increasing our citizenship's quality of life is enormous. So urgent action is needed. I would ask you to contact your local MP. I would also, because that local MP is a Conservative member of Parliament and may have less direct influence on policy decisions than we dream of, that you contact the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Science and ask them to support the findings of the panel. And like I say, I will send information through Knut to the group if that's of interest. Thank you.